Today we have two contributors. So our main speaker is Dr. Paul O'Shea from Lund University, and he tells us technically he's at home in Copenhagen today, so he's not in Sweden. And our moderator is Professor Heigo Sato, who is in Tokyo. And I'll just very briefly introduce them. So Paul O'Shea is Senior Lecturer at Center for East and Southeast Asian Studies at Lund University. And he is an expert on international relations in East Asia, and particularly Japan's relations with the US. And of course, Okinawa is absolutely central to that. He's written numerous articles about the military bases issue in Okinawa and about the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands territorial dispute with China. And our moderator, Professor Heigo Sato, is professor at the Faculty of International Studies and president of the Institute for World Studies at Takushoku University. And he has a history of working in defense-related areas, defense studies. He was also a special advisor to the Foreign Minister of Japan on disarmament and non-proliferation for a period in 2010. He is currently a board member of the Japan Association for International Security. So I'm going to pass over to Professor Sato.
Hello, good evening or good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. My name is Heigo Sato, professor at Takushoku University. As Jason has made the kind introduction of me, I worked with a defense issue for a while, yes. And I specialize in security, international security issues, and one of my topics is by U.S.-Japan alliances. And today I'm very happy to moderate the today's Daiwa webinar series with Mr. Paul O'Shea of the Lund University. To confess, I'm finally happy to see and talk with him about his academic articles and discussions, and so today I'm excited to host this webinar with for Paul. The topic of today is about Okinawa and it's essentially about the effect of the deterrence on the U.S. Marine base at Futenma. Maybe there are many of the audience would know, and maybe you have heard of the our base issues with our mainland and Okinawa. I do have experience of visiting Okinawa in several occasions, and I'm always fascinated by the beauty of the island and but at the same time, I'm always acknowledging the importance of the U.S. bases in Okinawa for our security and for U.S. Military strategy and their deterrence strategy as well. And as we have witnessing the coming of the U.S. new president, Mr. Trump, maybe this basing issue would be definitely will be a coming back again about how the from the alliance side of politics, we are discussing about whether the credibility of the or trustworthiness of the U.S. commitment to the Japanese defense is worthwhile to continue, or whether the U.S. would withdraw from some of the base in the East Asian regions. So this topic, which is the marine bases at Futenma especially, would be the central part of the discussion for next few years maybe. So I would like to, without further ado, I would like to hear how the Paul is looking at this issue and their discussion about the deterrence and with regard to U.S.-Japan alliance. Paul, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. And if you just allow me to share my screen. Okay. So yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate the introduction from Professor Sato and also the invitation from the Daiwa Foundation to discuss my research. Since we don't have that much time and there's a lot to discuss, as Professor Sato said, the new Trump 2 administration has come in with really profound impact on the US alliance with Japan. Also, we'll feel it here in NATO and Europe. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion in the second half of the seminar. So I will just jump straight into the paper. I will also say, I'm not going to go too much into the background of the Futenma base. I'm guessing a lot of people in this webinar are familiar with the base issue. For those who are not, there's a US Marine base called Futenma on Okinawa main island, and it's being moved to another location on the same island called Henoko. And actually, the Supreme Court decision was just finalized there last week. So it's finally going to fully go through. I think at this point, there's really nothing stopping the relocation from being finalized. Having said that, obviously public opinion on Okinawa is strongly against the relocation. There are local pockets near the Henoko which are in favor because they're going to benefit quite a lot financially. But overall, public opinion is against it. Politicians at all levels have asked for it to be relocated elsewhere. But as I say, the plan is that it's going to proceed, and that was really determined, I think last week when the decision was made at the Supreme Court level. So I say long saga. It's not the focus of my paper, but there's a lot of interesting scholarship out there giving both sides of the story. So if you're interested, I can happy to share some work that I found very interesting over the years. But for now, I should say that I've written, as we heard, a number of papers related to issues on Okinawa, including one on the power of the word deterrence, right? That is, so not a military analysis, but the discursive power. It was a media analysis. And the reason I wrote this paper was because it always struck me when studying the issue that in both US, but especially Japanese commentary and Japanese media reporting, there was this emphasis on the word deterrence. So what is deterrence? So deterrence has been this magic word, and it's been repeated in various media. It's cited by top US and Japanese officials. It's translated, US opinion pieces are translated that talk about the importance to deterrence. What is deterrence? I should say, put very simply, we'll come back to this, but it's stopping or deterring a state from attacking or making a move that you don't want by threatening retaliation or threatening to prevent it. So the retaliation might be that it makes the attack or the move too costly or too risky. And then we're going to talk today about extended deterrence. So that is, you have an alliance, you add the extended, because the US deters states or non-state actors from attacking it or doing things it doesn't want to itself, but then it extends that deterrence to an ally, promising to defend the ally if they're attacked. But the point isn't about defending. The point is about preventing the attack from happening in the first place. So deterring, that's what deterrence is all about. You don't need to defend to get involved in defending if you can deter. So the US Marine base on Okinawa has long been justified using deterrence, and it kind of is this magic word, as I say, because it shuts down the argument. And if you argue against it, or I've seen in the press over the years, people who argue against deterrence, they fail to understand deterrence. That's the quote, fail to understand deterrence. They are naive, could even be dangerous, and they threaten the security of all Japan. And the official line is that the base is fundamental to deterrence, and attempts to move it, they threaten the alliance, and they invite China to come in and step to fill the vacuum. So I became very interested in the idea, and I wanted to know to what extent did the base actually contribute to deterrence? So was it really fundamental to deterrence, or was it, as the critics would argue, a pretext that is an easy way for both Tokyo and Washington, D.C. to keep the Marines on Okinawa for political reasons, because there's a massive base there, because no one else wants the base, and that Okinawa would just have to endure. And it was a good choice as a term for that because it's kind of complicated. It's a very complicated concept. And the average person is not familiar with the ins and outs of the deterrence debates. So it's good to just shut down the conversation. So as I say, I wrote this paper. If you're interested, by all means, email me. I can send you a copy. The paper I'm going to present today, the military analysis, is open access. It was published with Social Science Japan Journal, which is the journal out of Tokyo University's Institute for Social Science. And that's open access. You can just find that on the internet. And I will say before I move on also, it's a very sensitive topic and I appreciate that. And I worked very hard to avoid bias. I don't straw man any arguments. My analysis is based on the claims which are made by Japanese politicians, analysts, officials, and some academics. And these are the claims you'll find in official documents and newspaper articles and so on. So I analyze these claims. And to do that, because these claims are often drawing on American sources, I use American sources. So my sources are the RAND Corporation, the US Department of Defense, or the Pentagon, CSIS, other mainstream and very influential and traditional think tanks and institutions. The reason I say that is because this is a very polarizing issue, and I understand that. And I want to be clear that I'm not using a Marxist or a critical or some other approach. I'm using a mainstream security studies approach to address the question in as an objective manner as possible. Okay, so having said all that, what is extended deterrence? I'd say very complicated in some ways, very simple in others. I'll give a very basic overview of the key concepts from the paper. The three things we have to think about are capabilities. So when you hear the word capabilities in this presentation, you just think military. Okay, so when I say capabilities, I mean ships, I mean planes, I mean missile defense systems, I mean drones, I mean cyber. That's what I'm referring to when I say capabilities. Communication. So this is really actually probably the most important thing, and research has shown it's probably the most important thing in successful deterrence, and that is that it is clear, it is explicit what the other side should do or not do, and what the consequences will be if they do the thing they're not supposed to do. You could call it the red lines, right? And we've seen over the years many times red lines have been crossed and nothing happens. When that happens, it eats away at credibility. Okay, so credibility is that the response must be credible. The will must be there. The communication must be believed. The threats must be believed. Will the US go to war over the Senkakus? Will the US go to war over Taiwan? Will Japan go to war over the Senkakus or Taiwan? And we'll come back to these. These are going to be the key concepts in the rest of the paper. The response, there's two types. There's denial and there's punishment. Denial is basically preventing the aggressor from succeeding. So, prevent the aggressor from occupying the Senkakus, prevent the aggressor from occupying, we're going to talk about the aggressor being China, from occupying or succeeding in Taiwan. And punishment is to impose costs through retaliation. So you think of punishment, it's retaliation. If you think of mutually assured destruction and nuclear weapons, this is where it comes from, right? So you're going to do something that's actually maybe unrelated to the aggression, but the costs are going to be so severe, you'll wish you never did the aggression. So then you don't do the aggression because of fear of the costs. I hope this is clear. If it's not, it's a bit abstract. We'll clarify it more as we talk about the Marine base itself. Final, central versus extended, I mentioned that. So just to say, it's much harder to make extended deterrence credible. After 9/11, the attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, the United States started two major wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. The repercussions are still going on today. That's credible, right? Central deterrence. If you attack the United States is going to do something. You can believe that. It's much harder to make credible. What are you going to do for your neighbor? And we see that especially in the Trump era. People really don't know what Trump would do actually if Japan or if NATO or so on is attacked. But this goes way back. I mean, the reason France has nuclear weapons is because in part they didn't believe that the United States would go to war in Europe for, would it exchange New York or would it exchange Chicago in a nuclear war for like Hamburg or Paris? It's hard to make it credible. Yeah. And the last thing there, so we must, key to any analysis, understand the aggressor's perspective. In the paper, I talk a bit about North Korea and China, but here we're going to focus really on China because it is China that is the main issue here. It's the main potential aggressor, right? So when we talk about the senkaku, I'm going to also say senkakus. It doesn't imply that I have a position on the dispute. It's just simpler to say senkakus than senkaku diayu every single time. That's obviously about Chinese aggression and the possibility of a blockade or Chinese occupation, and then Taiwan, the question of what do the Marines contribute to deterring China from invading or blockading Taiwan. Okay, I talk a lot about China in the paper, but we will skip on to the capabilities. To what extent does, and we have the question here, China's military capabilities, or the military calculation, change if the Marines were moved elsewhere? Well, I mean, this kind of the obvious point is that the Marines are insignificant in the overall deployment of US troops just in Japan, right? Not thinking about the rest of Asia or Guam or Korea or anything like that. Just even they're insignificant almost in thinking about the deployment on Okinawa, but we won't go that far. So in Japan, you have the 7th Fleet Carrier Group at Yokosuka. You have the 5th Air Force. You've got bases at Kadena, Yokota. You got the helicopter carriers at Kyushu, at Sasebo. You have missile cruisers. You have the whole amphibious squadron, actually. So from the broad general perspective, they're not really significant. Yeah, as I said, even on Okinawa, Kadena is the main base. If you look at what China writes, I don't read Chinese, but I've read reviews of Chinese military strategy and so, and they're never talking about Futenma. The Chinese are talking always about Kadena. That's the first target because that's the important base. Futenma doesn't really figure very much in Chinese calculations, in fact. So I would say on Okinawa, they're not the most important base. I think that's a safe statement. But one thing that is common in official Japanese statements and Japanese military media commentary but it's the strategic location, the local balance of forces. Over and over again, you see that their strategic location provides deterrence. And in fairness, if you see the map here, you think of Taiwan or the Senkakus, they are local, more local than bases off in Tokyo or in Kyushu. But in reality, the Marines are not going to engage directly in the Senkakus at first. That was the reality 10 years ago, well before first Trump, and it's certainly the reality now under second Trump. The understanding is that Japan leads and the US supports. And actually, Japan is developing its own central deterrence, going back to central versus extended. Japan is a top 10 military spender. It kind of goes up and down the list a little bit every year. Kishida talked a lot about increasing military budgets. But one thing that Japan has done is it has developed the Amphibious Rapid Deployment Brigade, the ARDB. That's a mouthful. We can just call it the Japanese Marines because it is the Japanese Marines. It was actually trained by the US Marines, mostly in California. It would be much easier if they were called the Japanese Marines, but they're called the ARDB. And their purpose, according to the Japanese Ministry of Defense, is, quote, to land, recapture, and secure without delay any remote islands that might be invaded. That sounds a lot like the Senkakus to me. It could be other islands, it could be other remote islands, but it really sounds a lot like the Senkakus. So what is their optimal strategic location? If the Marines, which are related by these officials and related in the media to the Senkakus, and their strategic location close to the Senkakus is important to deterrence, then where are the ARDB located? You would expect the answer to be Okinawa, but they're not. They're located in Kyushu. And the reason they're located in Kyushu is because that is, as it says here, and this is written by a former Japanese ground self-defense force general, deterrent posture by units location from peacetime is here, right? It's not down here. You regain by amphibious units. They come down from Sasebo where their transport is, and you get other rapid deployment units and you retake the islands. And this picture comes from a RAND report, which was commissioned by the Japanese government. So to be clear, in terms of local balance of forces, the Marines' role in any eventuality is undefined. So it's not clear that it would be involved. And the immediate geography is not relevant because the Japanese Marines are actually not located on Okinawa, they're located in Kyushu. to build on this, there was an excellent article in the journal International Security by two of the top scholars of Japanese security. That's Dick Samuels and Eric Higginbotham. Dick Samuels is sort of one of the most famous, if not the most famous, scholar of the field. And basically, implicitly, they even say that the ARDB, the Japanese Marines, was a waste in terms of the Senkakus and defending the Southwestern Isles. That was a wasted investment. They spent 40 pages talking about Japanese deterrence in this region. They don't mention the US Marines, or they mention them once, I think, in passing, which is striking. A 40-page article from the top scholars in the field. They don't mention the US Marines and deterrence. And they criticize the waste of money being spent on the Japanese Marines. And that's because if you're thinking about deterrence and you're thinking about the Senkakus or Taiwan, you know that any conflict, and all experts know this, it's going to be air-sea battle, right? I have it here. Like, it's going to be Navy, Air Force, missiles, drone swarms, and cyber. That's what the conflict will be, right? Because the Senkakus are tiny. They're very small. There's no cover. They're totally exposed. Nobody would land on the Senkakus in the middle of a conflict. It's impossible to hold the Senkakus. You would have to wait until the air-sea battle is over. The missiles are exhausted. You have control over the seas and the water, and then you would move. And that's why the ARDB, even though Samuels thinks that they're a waste, that's why they're located in Kyushu and not in Okinawa. So again, just to say that this really muddies the claim that their geographic location on Okinawa is key to their deterrent effect and their strategic effect. They would actually be better off. Thinking strategically, the Marines should be relocated, at least the bulk of them. Leave some Marines, sure, but the bulk of them will be relocated beyond immediate short-range missiles. And this brings me to this question, or the point that the Marines, all forces on Okinawa, in fact, are sitting ducks, because as I said, at the early stages of a conflict, it's going to be primarily a missile conflict, cyber conflict. It's going to be drone swarms. The key concept in US Marine and naval thinking at the moment is this distributed maritime operations. And what that just means is reducing the size of and dispersing assets, keeping them agile, moving them around, so that they don't become targets. China has an incredible missile program. It has thousands of cruise and ballistic missiles trained on Okinawa, on Guam, on other US bases in the region. And in an escalatory cycle, once that stage was reached, these main bases will be wiped out. I mean, Japan and Guam, they're building up their missile defense, but still, there's so many missiles, it's hard to defend against what China has. So yeah, anyway, the basic idea is places, not bases, agile, geographically dispersed, small units, so not concentrated on a small island in the direct line of fire. The old school Marines that we know from World War II, these thousands of Marines landing on an island, full frontal assault, that was in a very different era. So that's from 100 years ago almost. Now the Marines are a very different force. So yeah, in sum, the bases are basically not really mentioned in terms of deterrence in US security literature. And when they are, this is these bases specifically, not the Marines in general. It's to say how quickly they would be destroyed. So I ask, does that contribute to deterrence, in fact? Then we've got communication and credibility. We talked about this earlier, right? So in terms of communication, the alliance, it's tricky with Trump. Things have changed with Trump. Communication is a bit more complicated. But nonetheless, for example, with the Senkakus, Trump agreed. He followed what Obama had said, that the islands are covered under Article 5, so they would be defended. Again, it would be Japan that goes first, but they would be covered. Obama did this, Biden did this, Rubio and UIM just met. I guess they talked about it. I'm not sure it was top priority at the moment, but we might just hear again. It's been at the beginning of each new president has confirmed that the Senkakus are under the treaty, so I'm guessing that we'll hear something about it, or at least they'll talk about it. Yeah, so, sorry. Then you have the credibility. So as I said before, credibility is much more difficult under extended deterrence than under central deterrence. It is often stated, though, that opposition to Henoko damages deterrence and damages the alliance. So just to be clear, thinking about credibility in the US-Japan lines, and I'm saying this also sitting in a NATO country, one NATO country, and working in another NATO country, and thinking about NATO and deterrence and the situation that Japan faces versus the situation that NATO faces. And Japan is in a much better position, frankly speaking. Because, well, let me tell you what all of these things first and then come back to Trump too. So Japan has obviously the security treaty. How many decades have we had the security treaty? It has the huge forward deployment of troops scattered all across Japan and really vital bases for US power projection in the region. This also means it's a tripwire, right? I don't know if you've been following the Ukraine issue, but Ukraine is looking for assurances that either European or American troops would be on Ukrainian territory after a ceasefire, following a peace treaty. And the reason it wants that is because that's credibility. If Ukraine can get American troops on Ukrainian soil, that means that Russia is much less likely to attack because an attack on Ukraine would then drag the United States in immediately. So that's the point of these forward bases in terms of credibility and deterrence. So Japan has, the Marines are a tiny part of the forward deployment. So it has this massive forward deployment anyway. Also on Okinawa, as I said, the much more important base is Kadena. Huge levels of joint exercise. I'm drawing from the theory here now. They talks about the importance of joint exercises. The US and Japanese militaries are deeply interoperable. And of course, there are leadership statements over and over again, even if Trump is a little bit more complicated. But as I say, I would rather be sitting in Japan than in a NATO country in terms of the future of the alliance, because the fact of the matter is that as much as Trump might make noises about Japan, the United States is not interested in Russia and it is interested in China, and therefore Japan is indispensable to any United States China policy in a way that the European Union or NATO is not indispensable, because it really doesn't see Russia as a threat or as a significant in the same way as it sees China, as sort of China is the era-defining rival. So in that sense, Japan is sitting quite well. So anyway, from all of this perspective, it's hard to see that a relatively minor base, which isn't even the most important base on its island, plays a serious role here. Now, I don't think that China takes that seriously, I should also say. But you're thinking of credibility. If China saw the base moved away in an orderly, agreed fashion, very peaceful, normal fashion with all stakeholders involved, I don't think China would see that credibility of US extended deterrence would have changed in any way, shape, or form. What I do think is that the controversy around the issue does encourage China, or at least it makes China feel a little bit more optimistic. And I'm going to explain that now and I'll finish. So this comes to the irony of the Henoko base controversy, right? Because it's often depicted as, being in China's favor, creating a chink in the armor, like a gap in the armor. And you will read in both English and Japanese that China is funding the opposition. It's infiltrating the opposition with spies. Tokyo has consistently defined the Marines as part of deterrence, and it has consistently stated that the failure to move the Marines to Henoko, it will be moved, is damaging the alliance, and the deterrent message lies in the eyes of the receiver, that is China. So they are creating an alliance issue. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you keep saying something will damage the alliance and damage deterrence, it might actually end up damaging the alliance and damaging deterrence. Because the longer it goes on, the more problems it creates, the more it polarizes opinion, especially on Okinawa. Then you create a situation which is more favorable for China and worse for deterrence, actually. And one question is, why are they doing this? Why do they keep saying deterrence? That is an interesting question. Because you're talking about security experts who, read the same literature I read much more of it probably than I read, to be fair. And you got to remember sort of two things. One is fear of abandonment. So Japan fears abandonment from the United States, always has for 50, 60, 70 years. It's been the driver of Japanese strategic thinking. And Trump and US decline is only heightening that fear. And then the second thing is obviously Okinawa is far away. it's remote, and most people are not thinking about it. So, and Tokyo has been very good at playing divide and rule on Okinawa with compensation politics and exploiting the relative poverty, structural dependency of the region, targeting compensation to different groups who then will benefit economically from the bases while others might complain. And this is problematic. I mean, it works well in the short run, but this relocation has really galvanized Okinawan opinion in a way that very few issues have. So in the paper, I do give some more context, but there was a referendum a few years ago. Basically, 70-something% of the population were against the move. Okinawa used to be an LDP stronghold. It had the governorship, it had the diet seats. It's lost all of those. The governor has now been anti-base for several governors in a row. The diet seats are lost. This is the defining issue between Naha and Tokyo, actually. And relocating the base off Okinawa, I think it's probably too late now because it seems like it's going to go ahead, but it would have done much to soothe public opinion, reduce anti-base sentiment, and restore credibility. Because I think people also know that the deterrence argument is, I mean, I've given this rather complicated explanation. It's even more complicated in the paper, but I think people intuitively understand that it's not about deterrence, right? It's just about there's training grounds there that are good for the Marines. No one else wants the Marine base, and it's just inertia. It's simpler to keep it there. And everyone, I think most people in Okinawa know that, and they feel a little bit talked down to when they're told that this is crucial deterrence and strategic location and everything else. So yeah, framing a decision to move the base off Okinawa as part of a long-term plan to make the bases on the rest of the bases sustainable and resilient and keep the US there for longer could actually contribute to credibility of deterrence. But continuing with this relocation, I think, and the unjust treatment of Okinawa is actually probably just going to cause long-term damage to Okinawa-Tokyo relations, or Naha-Tokyo and Naha-Washington, D.C. relations. And who knows, maybe even undermine the long-term resiliency of the alliance and of deterrence. And I'll stop there because I see I've gone quite over time. So thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Paul. Those audience who is interested in his discussion more thoroughly or further understanding of his logic, you should definitely, I will recommend definitely you to read his article on Social Science Japan Journal from the Oxford Press. This was very interesting article indeed. And I was almost convinced by your beauty of the logic. But at the same time, I have several questions, and start with this question about deterrence. Deterrence, as you know, as you mentioned, is a concept which is developed during the Cold War, and it is mostly focuses on the deterrence of the deterrence related to the nuclear weapons. And I actually do have some I feel uncomfortableness or uneasiness about applying the not on your discussion, but in the Japanese political discourses as well. Applying the deterrence logic and discourses into the conventional weapon issues and alliance management. You actually referred that there are two types of deterrence, which is denial and the punishment. But still, you have more concept like basic deterrence or existential deterrence. So concept of deterrence is very flourishing. I think if you talk about the conventional issues and alliance issues, I think the deterrence would be more, a core concept of the deterrence would be more obscure and more, puzzling concept, which is to deal with the security issues. And the base issues in Japan or US based issue is always the filled with this mystery of deterrence. Why they are necessary? Why they should be in Okinawa, or why the, as you said, the ARDB must be located in Sasebo, which is a part of the Kyushu island. There are no quite clear-cut answers to these issues. I am often interviewed from the media and is often asked that is this a certain move of SDF would enhance the deterrence or decrease the deterrence?
Mm.
Obviously, there is no answer to that, the questions. So what is more interesting about this issue is that is there deterrence should be the only ways or only method or only weapons for Japanese government or U.S. Military, U.S. government to persuade the Japanese public about the existence of or relocation of the basis. Or my question to you is that if the deterrence has some, obscuring effect on the alliance discussions. My question to you is that is there any alternatives? If there are some alternatives, it would be more easy, or more maybe we can have more sophisticated argument about alliance management on this issue. So I will first this question to you and have your reaction to that.
Excellent. Yes, thank you very much for that very thoughtful response. And I agree with everything that you've said. Actually, I can't find anything in there to disagree with. It's a very difficult question that you came with at the end. What would you substitute in? But yeah, so I suppose when you read, and this is, so in many ways, I think my paper doesn't actually tell us that much new. I think it says something that many people, especially experts, kind of already know, right? It's not really deterrence. I just wrote the paper because I wanted to prove it for once and for all that I could say it's not. Um, but I mean, I can hear from what you're saying, you also don't think it's about deterrence, right? That deterrence is this thing that's actually used to persuade the public. And I suppose when you read, and I've read an awful lot for the previous paper, an awful lot of media articles and official documents in Japanese, whenever you read deterrence, you could probably just put in the word alliance. And that's the same meaning essentially, because when they say it damages deterrence or it reduces deterrence, what they really mean is it's about the alliance. And I suppose the question then comes to what I was talking about at the end. Is it damaging in the long run to use an idea to persuade the public, especially the Okinawan public, that they intuitively know is not true, or is it better to tell them the truth? Now, I mean, politicians, whether they're Japanese, whether they're Swedish, Danish, British, you can't be a politician and tell the truth all the time. You would be a very bad politician. You would be the worst politician. You wouldn't last. That's just the job. So I mean, what I argue in the conclusion is that yes, it's worse to use this sort of mystification of deterrence because I think people see through it and you can't have an honest and frank discussion. And I think an honest and frank discussion is what you have to have because Okinawa is back in the firing line again. It is in this key location. Everybody knows it. Everybody also knows how many missiles are pointed at Okinawa. Like, Okinawans are not stupid. And if you want to keep people who live with the bases on board going into the future, as things may even become more stressful in the region and more tense, you should be working with them and being very frank with them. And I think you run the risk of really alienating them. You've mentioned, Professor Sato, that you've been covering security for, I think you decided to just say many years in the end. I have been covering it for fewer years than you, but still, 20 years, let's say. And this issue has just gone every year more and more to the heart of Okinawa's relations with Japan. In a way, it's the dominant issue, and I don't think it's just going to fade down. So I think that a more honest approach and a more realistic approach is the only approach, because I think it will cause long-term damage, frankly. And that could threaten the resiliency of the other bases also. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I started my grad school at early 90s. So
Okay.
maybe 10 years senior to you
Right.
on this issue. And looking back at these 30 years of my studies, the Okinawa issues, Okinawa base issues and credibility of alliances was always there, actually. We are, as you mentioned in your paper, how do you say that? Okinawan school girl incident happened in the late 90s, and that's a negative impact of the U.S. forces are still there, still dominant in the hearts and minds of Okinawan people. So we must face a reality, and but at the same time, as you mentioned, we have, if you talking about the politics of the base issues, bases are, is not a car or convenient tool which can move from this location to other locations. They need a long time commitment, and they have to maintain the momentum. So that in that regard, I think you heard correctly that deterrence was a very convenient tool, although it is not an honest explanation to the Japanese public or Okinawan people, but deterrence was the only answer they had throughout this 30 some years. But at the same time, the security situations are gradually changing, and China's military threat is whether there is a question about whether Chinese military threat is real, or Chinese military threat is can be dealt with the existing alliance networks. We don't have a clear answer because we don't have a clear evidence to prove it. But at the same time, Biden administration has conducted the gradual shift from the deterrence to what we call it in Japanese, we call it a taisho. In English, maybe a deal with or handling with the issue, or emphasis on the operation side of the alliance in their Pacific deterrence initiatives. And Pacific Deterrence Initiative is welcomed, I would like to say, by the Japanese security experts, because they are not just putting the U.S. bases for tripwire, or they are not just praising the U.S. Marines as sitting ducks, which the expression that I love, but they shifted from those, very static forces, which represent the credibility, into the more operational and the more, cooperative attitude or cooperative, measures in which to deal with the security threat in this region. So in that regard, I think the Marine increased cooperation with US SDF and Marines have enhanced the credibility of the US commitment, actually, and enhanced the communication against and within the against China or within the alliance as well. So in that regard, how do you see the shifting, role of Marines from the deterrence into operational existence, and how does basing issue would affect how that shift would affect the base issues in that regard? And we Japanese government has invested quite a bunch of money on the relocation. We have to reclimate is that correct answer? Reclimate the coastline of the Henoko. And it was a huge investment. And actually, Okinawa has benefited from the huge investment done by the Japanese government. So policy is always a path dependent. Policy is always have to be, shifting, adaptive to the shifting environment. So what is your reaction about the Biden's, initiative so far? And
Hmm.
how do you assess the role of the marine bases in that regard?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And again, I mean, I think I agree with everything that you said. I mean, I see the changes too in the way that the Marines are the plans for the use of the Marines in contingency situations. I talked a bit about the like the distributed maritime operations in the paper. I go into much more detail. The Marines are changing. Fundamentally, the US Marines and their role are changing. And that really did start, I think, primarily with the Biden administration, but it does go a little bit further back. But I completely agree that what I'm talking about in the paper is not what the Marines have become today, actually. And but I don't think it changes the argument specifically about Henoko, because Henoko isn't needed for this new agile, dispersed operational Marine force. And so that's why I want to differentiate between the Marines in Japan or the Marines in the region and the specific base of Henoko. I mean, it's true. There's the sunk cost problem, right? Henoko is a sunk cost problem. So much money and so much political capital and reputation has been staked on this base that, changing course at this point seems impossible. But the sunk cost is a fallacy, right? I mean, that's the nature of sunk cost. It feels like you can't stop because of the sunk cost, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't. Um, so yeah, that would be my initial response, I guess. Yeah.
So how do you advise, if you're advisor to the Prime Minister, how do you advise the cost, sunk cost
Mm.
about the Henoko? How do you think about Japanese government? What is your opinion about what Japanese governments to do to deal with the sunk cost?
Well, I mean, strategically, say Ishiba, I mean, just off the top of my head, since Ishiba has positioned himself many times as contra Abe, and it was Abe who pushed Henoko, he could simply say, he believed it or not, he could simply say that he's always opposed Henoko. He thought it was a bad idea. This is just another example of a thing that Abe did, which was bad for Japan, blah, blah, blah. And he, unlike, say, other LDP leaders who were much more close to Abe, they would have a very hard time distancing. I mean, Kishida could never have distanced himself from Henoko, but maybe Ishiba could actually distance himself from Henoko because he was this sort of anti-Abe figure. I mean, it's a thorny one, it's a difficult one, but I think of all leaders, probably Ishiba would have the ability to put light between himself and that decision. Um, yeah, but I see what you're saying. It's politically a very difficult move. Yeah, I wouldn't
Well,
want to be
thank
in
you.
that situation. Yeah.
Good. Me too, actually. Actually, I personally talked with Ishiba-san when he
Oh,
was, he was bashed from the Abe administration, and actually he was talking about Okinawa issue. He had a profound interest in this issue as well. So I think he will. I don't know what his final answer would be, but I would definitely will expect him to make some bold move. I don't, but I don't disagree with him, even if his conclusion was to maintain the status quo. But since we are my Q&A or discussion time was assigned until 50 or something. I would like to throw you the last question, but the very difficult question.
okay.
What do you think about Trump? What is your prospect about effect of the Trump administration on the Okinawa or Okinawa issue, and more specifically on the U.S.-Japan alliance?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. So yeah, I guess as you probably or you may remember, when he came in first, there was actually quite some optimism in Okinawa that Trump was going to be in favor of a little bit of retrenchment, not full retrenchment, but there was optimism that Trump somehow would prevent the Henoko move and say it was a waste of money and that we shouldn't be doing this kind of thing and so on. Obviously, that didn't transpire. So based on that, I think nobody should have too high expectations for Trump's personal interest or involvement in Okinawa. I think he doesn't have any. And I think his team is pretty much mainstream Republican, Marco Rubio and so on. I don't think we should expect too much. I wouldn't expect much difference from the first Trump administration in terms of US-Japan relations, perhaps except in the rhetoric. I think his rhetoric is going to be a bit more extreme because he doesn't have people who will necessarily calm him down in the way he did the first time around. But I do mean what I say, actually, what I said at the beginning. I think that Japan is much better placed. And I think that the first Trump administration really shows how Japan is well placed. And I hope that the Ishibe administration recognizes that Japan has a lot of leverage, because Japan does have a lot of leverage over the US. The US can't contain China without Japan. And that's a basic principle, and Trump knows it. And I would say, just in closing, in my opinion, that he has shown that he is much more likely to respect and show preferential treatment of individuals and states which stand up. So I think that it's in Japan's interests to make it very clear that they have leverage and that they know that they have leverage. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Very encouraging. So I think there are many issues in common between Japan or East Asia and Europe. So I wish we could continue those discussions with regard to the security and how to deal with the second Trump administration.